Ladies and gentlemen, it is Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran, and we're going to be taking a look at some helmet cam footage from the fighting in Severodonetsk. And we are going to ask the larger question of, is it even worth it to still be fighting in these brutal city-to-city, block-by-block fights? Let's get into it. So this comes to us from the Telegraph via an Instagram account called Antonikov, and this looks like helmet cam footage of a fighter that the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense says is taking place in Severodonetsk. First off, let's see if we can get this thing reoriented. Oh, no, no. He's firing from an angle, but look at the level of destruction of this building. You can see every car has been burned out to the point where the paint is literally stripped from it. There's what look like shrapnel holes in the ceiling of this. It looks like they're in maybe an overpass or a loading dock of a building, but still, just the level of destruction is just tremendous here. Yeah, this looks like an overpass. So you can see they're in some sort of super close range firefight. I mean, so close that you can hear the enemy rounds being fired, almost as loud as you can hear the helmet cam users' rounds being fired. So you can see this looks like a Ukrainian regular infantry. You notice that there's a lot of consistency in their gear. They all have the same helmets. They all have the same plate carriers, right? When you look at like territorial defense units, foreign volunteers, you see much more of a mishmash of different types of plate carriers, different levels of equipment. So these guys look like what are called regular army troops. That's usually, or regular troops. And traditionally, regular troops refer to full-time, standing, properly trained armed forces. Irregulars, this would be in usually in the 1700s, they would refer to, say, a militia, in which they didn't wear regular uniforms, but were still a combat force. And as a general rule, regulars were considered the elite troops, irregulars or militia were considered a little bit below. And I don't know, I would be curious to know if that has played out here, or if it's a case where units have gained enough combat experience that more or less they've all sort of evened out in experience. Because training can obviously count for a lot initially, gives you a whole bunch of knowledge that you wouldn't otherwise have. But if you combine a basic level of training and combat experience in which you're continuously learning and improving, that is an unstoppable combination. This is why you can see in the statistics, experienced troops just do exponentially better. If you've listened to my other videos, you know that the U.S. Army found that it took about 100 days of deployment experience for units to drop their casualty rates. They become harder to ambush, harder to attack, much better at recognizing threats. And we've hit that 100-day mark here in Ukraine last week. So what you're going to see, I think, is units that, again, have not been attrited down badly. You're going to see them with a really, really improved level of proficiency. They're going to know the ins and outs of anti-armor attacks, in this case, urban combat. Okay, first off, I want to just try to do a quick little weapons breakdown. We only see a part of it here, but let's see if we can get more of it. There we go. That's a good shot. Okay, so it looks like he's got a Picatinny rail with a front sight, but this particular style of front sight is actually, I believe, an AK style of front sight, I think. I might be wrong. I'm trying to recall here. Yeah, because the US style of front sight tends to be the flared out post, but this could still be a US style weapon, right? This usually I think it's an M4 style of weapon. And I say that because there's no blowback, right? The AKs have a sort of gas blowback like mechanism that's going to feed up through the top of the weapon. So I think this is an M4 style weapon. Generally, you can see he has a flashlight mounted to the side. He has an underbarrel or some sort of foregrip here that looks like maybe a small, like 3-finger foregrip, and he has a close combat optic. looks like not quite an M68, right? It's too high on the risers for that. But this is, and you notice it's all painted the same color camouflage. So that's another interesting call. But I think it reflects the fact that, again, these are regular troops with really good quality equipment. So now we cut to what it says is a Russian state-funded news agency sharing footage that is purportedly of a chemical plant in Severodonetsk burning. But what I want to point out too is that, man, this is just another completely obliterated building. I mean, look at just the level of destruction. The glass is gone, the radiator's destroyed, but what's sort of fascinating is that a lot of these buildings, you can see here, the roof is basically collapsed. This entire building is blown out. But when it pans to the left, you can see here that this actually looks like a little more intact. There's a bomb hole there, but it's tough to say. It looks like certain key buildings that are optimal defensive spots or located, for example, at strategic crossroads, are taking the bulk of the fighting, right? And I imagine this chemical plant is probably one of them. It's probably in the downtown, probably adjacent to a large bridge, maybe even a railway, right? That tends to be how industrial areas are built up, industrial cities. You obviously want your city's industrial product to be able to raw materials to be brought in and the finished products to be moved out. And so they tend to be in strategically valuable locations, near rail yards, near bridges, near ports, and near major roadways. So control over those industrial buildings tends to be pretty essential. As we've seen in Mariupol, you also have the strategic value of simply a defensive fortification, right? Chemical plants, other industrial plants, but especially chemical plants, because they're so large and because they hold hazardous chemicals, they tend to be built a little bit sturdier, right? To both protect the actual chemical plant from, say, break-ins, but also to protect the surrounding area from chemical leaks. So you just tend to see, plus when you have multiple floors that are expected to hold, 10,000 plus gallon, tanks, they're going to be built with some sturdier stuff as opposed to a house that's only going to have a person and your furniture being held on each floor. So I think that's why you end up seeing time and time again heavy fighting take place in big industrial plants. Now, one of the things that's curious about this, the governor of the Luhansk region says that Russians control about 70% of the city. Now, here's what I find so interesting, is that repeatedly, it is so very difficult for the Russian and Ukrainian forces to push anyone out of a major urban area. You saw a couple hundred, maybe even as little as a couple dozen troops stall the entire Russian army at Mariupol. And the reason I point this out is because ultimately Russia realized that there just wasn't much of a reason for them to try to dig them out. It was a minor annoyance and would tie up some small number of troops to have them there. But you ask yourself, would it be better if simply the Russians or Ukrainians just stopped fighting in these cities? They're manpower intensive, they're resource intensive. It's true that cities are obviously invaluable, but as we've seen in this video, these cities are destroyed, man. They're gone. The chemical plant is on fire, just burning down, right? The city's industrial heart. You can see these buildings have just been obliterated. You're like, what's left to fight over? And why would you divert so much of your combat power to these cities? You ask yourself, are we moving to a technological and tactical phase of warfare where instead of heavy urban in combat, where, let's be honest, it's really hard to, even if you can push the enemy out of a city, it's so hard to hold it, right? And where, based on sort of the resource constraints of warfare, would you be better off just isolating a city, cutting it off from its support network, and moving on through the battlefield, right? Encircle the cities, let the remaining enemy troops starve or just simply sit there, right? Not contributing to the fight, while your main army moves on and pushes to other urban areas. Again, it's tough to say. Is this a better, would that work? It's worked in the past. In the medieval era, that was how fighting was done. Oftentimes, even in early World War II, that was how fighting was done. You often would simply bypass cities in favor of trying to meet the enemy at places where they were not as prepared. But all in all, it's hard to deny, it's hard to accept that your enemy will occupy many of your key cities. And it's tough to say that it's still not worth it to occupy all your population centers. In Afghanistan, of course, the US controlled the main population centers basically through the duration of the war, but it wasn't really decisive. The Taliban remained a very effective fighting force basically anywhere outside the city limits. And ultimately, the Taliban did come out on top despite controlling none of the urban areas until the very, very end of the conflict. Anyway, guys, thanks so much for joining me on this one. Hopefully, you learned something. Let me know if there's other videos you want me to check out. And as always, if you want my takes, my reactions on footage that's too spicy for YouTube, become a Patreon member. Thanks to our Lieutenant Tier patrons. I'll see you in the next one.